So Jai Bhim and Namo Buddhaya to all of you who are joining today for the fifth session of our ongoing course on learning Dhamma with Jataka tales. And so far we have covered a lot of ground about studying the Jataka tales, and we have had some interesting readings throughout our four sessions. And as we embark on our penultimate session today, I am going to talk about something very important that is related to the very heart of Buddhism as to how we can cultivate our mind. So, I prepared a small presentation which I will put up for you all so that it will help us to understand what we are talking today. So, the fifth session, I titled it as Cultivation and Healing of Mind with the Jataka stories. And as we know that whenever we talk about Buddhist practices, we talk about the cultivation of mind. But the another aspect of the cultivation of mind is sometimes our mind needs healing. Sometimes we have some kind of a trauma. Sometimes we have some kind of a psychological disorder, maybe some kind of an psychiatric problem. Throughout our lives we undergo a lot of abnormalities of our minds, and so it is Buddhism is not just about cultivation of the mind itself, but it's also about how we can process the different sort of various sort of the maladies that we face in our lives because of certain disorders. So this is broadly I have titled it, but I'm going to take a broad sweep as to what we are going to discuss today. So this is what we have been doing in the last four sessions. We have been studying various categorization of the 550 Jataka stories and how the categorization helps us to appreciate the multiple functions, multiple dimensions of the Jataka birth stories. And as we have seen that the birth stories are therefore not just entertaining stories, but they are didactic, they are educative in nature. And for example, we have seen how these stories, these narratives can help us to understand how we can act in the world as it is called the moral creativity. And one of the Buddhist professors, Charles Halise, has developed a concept called the moral anthropology, the anthropology of the morality itself in various cultures, including the Buddhist cultures. And there are, the invaluable resources the Jataka tells, as we know, to understand the history, sociology, economics, and the politics of ancient India as well. And not just ancient India, but also we can glean a lot of information about various communities. As we have seen in the previous four sessions, they refer to the core Buddhist values of just society and harmonious society. And as we have seen that, they are so helpful to us to categorize, the foundational values of liberty, equality, fraternity, dignity, and democracy, as emphasized by Baba Ambedkar. We can find them in the Jataka tales. So what we will be studying in this session, we are going to broadly talk about the mental cultivation. And whenever we talk about mental cultivation in the Buddhist context, we talk about bhavana. We don't talk about samadhi or sati because they are the component of the bhavana. And in the traditional Theravada countries, we talk about the three things that we need to cultivate, that completes the total path. That begins with the dana, and then shila, morality, ethics, and then, of course, bhavana, the mental cultivation. So, what we are going to see today that, the Jataka tales also offers us a very rich sort of resource for the mental cultivation. And what is the mental cultivation is all about? It's like having a fundamental shift in our perceptions. It's a and making it more like the perception of the Buddha as to how the Buddha looks at the world from to orient our minds so that we can look at the world from the Buddha's eyes, from the Buddha's point of view, if you want to use the word point of view. So, besides offering various functions, as we have seen, the Jataka birth stories are rich in content and have high value in terms of psychological, psychoanalytical, and psychotherapeutic aspects. So, just to have a disclaimer, I have not studied pharma psychotherapy. So, it's whatever we are going to talk about is going to talk about through one of the very interesting books that has a profound impact on me, which I read a couple of years back, and it kind of hit me so hard that it brought me to the, I would say, the appreciation of the Jataka tales. And I'm going to talk about that book. So what we are going to do is we are going to have a broad survey. We are not going to have a focus on certain aspects. And we will focus on some of the interesting ideas as brought out by the scholars, particularly in the area of the narrative literature, the stories, even poems, how they help us to cultivate our mental, our mind, our mental state. The word for it in Buddhism is Bhavana. And a lot of scholarship is now has gone into this area as to showing how the narrative literature is very important aspect, not just meditation. It is of course important to cultivate some kind of awareness as taught by the Buddha, the sati, but it's at the same time very important to engage with the literature, the Buddhist philosophy, the Buddhist normative, narrative literature, so that we have that shift in the mind. And I'm going to talk about how we can achieve that shift in the mind. So let's begin. This is a very interesting term that, these days we talk a lot, particularly in the Western world, about mindfulness. And we talk about mindfulness is traditionally termed as sati, awareness. And the most popular word used in the world today is mindfulness. But the Buddhist scholars who study different aspects of Buddhism, they are saying that the underlying concept is sati sampajana, to be aware with understanding. And sampajana, of course, has a broader meaning of ethics, of sila. And this particular word, sati sampajano, is very much applicable in the context of the Jataka stories as to how the bodhisattva behaves or acts in the world with the awareness of the, we can say, the awareness and the clear seeing. So we have in the world today mindfulness-based cognitive therapies, mindfulness-based stress reduction, mindfulness-based pain management. It's all about mindfulness, meditation. Whenever we talk about Buddhism, it is only about meditation. And I was referring to this great scholar of Buddhism, Professor Charles Halise. His teachers are from Sri Lanka, and he regards them in a very high respect. So he tells a story, very interesting story of he took some of the Western scholars, some Western students of Buddhism, to meet his teacher, Sri Lankan teacher in Sri Lanka, and he was not there in the meeting. And after the end of the meeting, his teacher, very his beloved teacher, came, smiling and laughing. And Charles asked him what happened, and apparently he told him that all the questions, all that the Western people, Western Buddhists asked him was about meditation, only about meditation, mostly about meditation, mostly about meditational techniques. And he was laughing, and he said, the only time I remember I meditated was when I was a child. It's a big scholar. He's a very big scholar of Buddhism, and he has brought so much of great studies by the way of his scholarship. So you see, this is a very interesting idea. But where is the scope for the stories? Where is a scope for the narratives? Where is a scope for the Jataka stories in our Buddhist practices? So as we know that the researchers in the area of story, and there is an emerging science of storytelling which cuts very deep into the human psychology. And people claim that the word is the story and the stories are the words. So you see, we all live in a certain story. We have a certain script, and we live by that script. If you look at the religious literature, it's a story. Story of the beginning and the story of the end, right? And so you see, there is this beginning and the end of the narrations which are going on all the time in our experiences of the in the world. So I just put this statement to enable us to think, and to prod us to really understand what the how the human complex mind is also a story making mind, storytelling mind, story loving mind. We cannot get rid of the stories of our minds, but what kind of the stories we hear, how they orient our minds, how they make us see the world in a different way. I think this is what the great stories do, and that is what the Jataka tells do. So I think this is a very interesting area. So just by way of the introduction in the domain of how stories can affect our mind, I would talk today about these two stories of the Siddhartha's renunciation. Very interesting stories. So there is a first narrative stories that of course all of us know. All the Buddhists are familiar with that. That the Buddha's Siddhartha Gautama's father was told that he has only two careers left in front of him. Either he can become the Buddha or he can become the Chakravarti. And of course, every father would like his son to become a Chakravarti. And one of the scholars, I was reading something very interesting. I don't remember the name of the scholar, but he talks about Ashoka and Ashoka's son. And when Bhikshu asked him that what you have taught your son about the Dhamma, and apparently Ashoka is not inclined towards making his son Kunal, his beloved son Kunal, a monk. He wants him to become an emperor. This sort of a story, brings us to the not just biographies, but actually to the mind of the person. Like, imagine, Ashoka is such a great benefactor of Buddhism, without whom the Buddhism would not have been what it is today. We might not be even talking about Buddhism. That was the greatness of Ashoka. And this story shows kind of a very complex mind of Ashoka, that he, on one hand, he has let his son and daughter to go to Sri Lanka and spread the Dhamma. On the another hand, he's not reluctant. He's reluctant to let his very beloved son Kunal to get ordained. There are very beautiful stories about Kunal in the Buddhist literature. So how do we understand this intention of Suddhodana, the pure rice Shuddhodana, has he according to the story that we have been handed over to, that he built three palaces for him. He made sure that Siddharth won't be able to witness any of the ugliness of their lives. But it happened so that his charioteer Chanda or Chandaka took him to the city, and he happened to see the old person. And he happened to, they say that in some narration it said that it happened in one visit. In some narration it says that it happened in the 4 consecutive days. But whatever is, the basic skeleton of the story remains the same. He witnessed the 4 sides of an old person, sick person, a dead person, and finally a renunciate. And that created a samveg in the mind of Siddharth, and made him renounce his home and become homeless. So that is the story, and that's the most popular story. If you challenge that story, then it's become apocryphal. The people would say that it's you are not Buddhist. So let's look at the story from a very interesting perspective. This is the story that is depicted in one of the cartoons, and you can see that the Buddha is witnessing an old man. He asks Chandaka, am I also going to get old? And Chanda gives a very succinct, very direct answer. Yes, your body is not immune from not getting old. And then you see the sick man, and he sees a dead man. And if he sees somebody who has renunciated the world and is trying to seek the truth. So this is a traditional story and very interesting story. And this is a very interesting book which has come up recently, written by a Buddhist scholar, a professor of Buddhism, Karen Deris. And she suffered from the brain cancer. And of course, her Buddhist studies have brought her in contact with not just the normative, teachings of the Buddha, but also the narrative teachings of the Buddha. And in this book, where she talks about how the stories, particularly the Buddhist stories, have helped her to deal with the trauma that comes up with when you are diagnosed with some kind of a terminal disease. And she is suffering from this terminal cancer, brain tumor, or very worst kind of brain tumor. Very interesting book that I recommend all of you to read, as to how the stories can make an impact. And before we understand this particular facts of life, that there is an old age, there is sickness, and there is an eventual death. But these particular things, this just remain outside us until we are hit directly by some kind of a disease. In the case of Professor Deris, the terminal cancer, the brain cancer, and the way she has to fight through it. And then something she talks about very interesting, that the first three sides are all experienced by human beings, but they are external to us, and only when they begin to arise in our own body, they sort of drive our attention towards them. And I think this is a very interesting way, the way she talks about it, that when that disease happens in our own bodies, not the bodies out there, but in my own body, if I see some kind of a disease, when I see myself growing old, when I realize my imminent death, then it has a kind of a shock value. And that's where our Buddhist practice comes. Otherwise it becomes just a theory, unless we realize that in our body. And that's why the awareness of the body is the very important step towards our own liberation. But as you have noticed that this is all about our body. This episode, this narration only talks about our body. It doesn't talk about a lot of things that we experience in our lives. So the second narration that we talk about, about the narration chosen by Baba Sahib Ambedkar in the Buddha and his Dhamma. And I find it very interesting narration. It's the war between the Shakyans and the Kolians, the two dear families which were dear to the Buddha, because he was related with both of them. His wife was a Kolian, and his relatives from the mother sides were from Kolia. And despite of that, we know that there was a quarrel between the Sakyans and the Kolians about the river of the water of the river Krohini. And we know the story. Siddhartha didn't want war, and he renunciated because he did not want to be the party to the war. He did not want to side with any of the things. And it came to a point where Buddha has to leave the home. And this is very interesting, that like in the first story we see that it's all about body. It's all about the death of the body, the diseases in the body, and ultimately the death of the body. And of course there are the teachings which tells us how we cannot be attached to the body. And but interestingly, if you look at the framework of the four noble truths, jati pi dukkha, jara pi dukkha, vyadhi pi dukkha, marnan pi dukkha, and appihehi sampayogopi dukkho, piyehi vipayogopi dukkho. But in the first narration, there is no appihehi sampayogopi dukkho or piyehi vipayogopi dukkho. Yampi ichham na labati tampi dukkham. It's not there in the first formulation, first narrative. And Sankitena in a nutshell, pancha upadan khandapi dukkha. So if you look at this, this narration is kind of an extension of the very formula that the Buddha gave when he talked about the Four Noble Truths. So this is about interpersonal dukkha. This is about intergroup dukkha, intergroup conflict that leads to dukkha. And by extension, this is the social dukkha. This is about the wars that we are seeing today in the world. And this narrative story point out to a very interesting domain of the mindfulness of others. And so you see, when we talk about the story, the story of renunciation in terms of the four sides, which is valid, but it's limited just to the body. But when you talk about the story of renunciation from what Baba Ambedkar has emphasized, we talk about how we can behave in the world, not just in some abstract way where we become detached with our body, but this is about how we behave in the world, how we act in the world. What are the essential practices that can help us? So this points out to the essential practice from the standpoints of, of this version behind the renunciation of home by Siddhartha is a moral action. It's an ethical action, moral creativity, moral resourcefulness. It boils down to the transformation of the world itself. So I just wanted to, highlight this, how these stories affect us. So for example, if we are in the domain of one story, then the way our mind unfolds outside in terms of the Buddhist practice is little bit different from the when you are in the garb of a story which talks about the Buddha's renunciation in terms of the dealing with the conflict in the world. Our Buddhist practice unfold very differently in the world. So this is what I just wanted to bring out. And it's up to us which stories we choose. And there are plethora of stories. As we see in the context of the Jataka, there are 550 Jataka tales. So just, by the way of comparison, I brought it. We will not dwell a lot of time here. But, something very interesting happening in the Buddhist scholarship. Particularly, there is an interesting book edited by Professor Vanessa Sasson and Christine Schibel in honor of a great Buddhist scholar. His name John Strong. He has done a lot of pioneering work on the biographies of the Buddha and biography of Ashoka. His biography of the Ashoka and translation of Ashoka Vardhana is very famous. And there is a book now which talks about the life of the Buddha in terms of the stories, and how many expansion of so many stories can enable us to understand the human Buddha. And I find this idea very interesting, to touch upon, the mind of the Buddha as to how, he his mind worked. So I'm not going to go into that, but I'm going to, this is the story, the Buddha, the book I was referring to. And I'm going to just briefly touch upon, the story that comes in the Chinese uh, Buddhism. It's about the Buddha's last days, and he's traveling from. I'm going to relate the story to you with you. This is a story. This is very interesting. So, the Buddha is. This is the story of the Buddha in the final days, where he has recently recovered from the dysentery. So it's maybe 1 or 2, 3 days before the Buddha died or attained to Mahaparinirvana. And he had his what is called Sukkara Madhava, translated as pig's delight, at the house of Chunda in Pava. And he's on his final journey to Kushinagara, and he is very frail elderly man whose body, as he puts it, is a creaking along like a broken down cart held together with straps. A very interesting story. We imagine the Buddha to be very young, but here is a old Buddha. His body is has weakened, is falling apart. And the Mallas of Kushinagari, Malla means, of course, the wrestlers. They were also wrestlers. The Mallas of Kushinagari, learning that he is coming, decorate the streets of their city in anticipation of his arrival. At the same time, they send some of their young men out to the countryside to clear and clean up the road, because the Buddha is coming, the Lord is coming, so that his way will be made smooth and easy. They run into a trouble. What kind of a trouble they run into? That they find a huge boulder, and measure of the boulder is given 60 by 30 cubits, hasta by hands. There's a huge boulder on the road, embedded in the ground and blocking the path. At first, they attempt to dig it out themselves, but with no success. Then they try to uproot it with teams of camels, then oxen, then elephants, to break it apart by hitting it with diamond hard wedges, to destroy it with medicinal herbs, like, some kind of a chemical they apply so that, the boulder will blast away, to make it disappear by means of mantras that they try to apply some spells so that, it will go. All to no avail. They merely succeed in exhausting themselves. So the Mallas, they cannot move the boulder. Then the Buddha comes together with Ananda and a group of disciples and asks them what they are doing. They explain, we heard you were visiting the land of the Mallas and had reached Pava, and we're heading our way. We wanted to make ready the road for you, but we encountered this big boulder. And, the Buddha removes the big boulder, and it's a very interesting story. So I'm going to read it, a little bit. It is clear that this rock is problematic in its materiality because it's a huge rock. It might as well be a mountain, for it is a major stumbling block, not so much for the Buddha, as we shall see, but for the Mallas, whose desire to honor him is being stymied by its immovability. But there is something else at work here. People who do great things to honor the Buddha, such as building stupas, commissioning images, or in this case, clearing the beauty and beautifying a road, do so not only out of devotion for him, but also out of a desire to magnify their own merit, so that, they are enlightened in the future. Because the Buddha is called the Punyashitra. Anything you do for the Buddha, even if you look at the Buddha, it's meritorious. So the Buddha, the Mallas of Kushinagar, they are in competition with the Mallas of Pava. The Pava Buddha has just left, and they want to treat him extremely well. But, the Mallas are not happy because they couldn't remove it, and it's a hard work. So the Buddha, what the Buddha does, The Buddha says that you little boys, you cannot move this small, boulder. So the Mallas are of course angry because the Buddha calls them little boys, Kumaraka. So he chides them. And the Buddha, removes this particular uh, boulder. So, how they ask him how you remove the boulder. And Buddha says that through his human strength, born out of his mother and father, he has removed it. So Buddha is actually talking about the human efforts. So very interesting. But there is also a miracle that the Buddha performs. He lifts the heavy stone, which is not lifted by any of them, and he throws them in the in the in the sky, and it says that it crosses all the universes which are mentioned in the cosmology of Buddhism, all the way up to the top, heaven. But then the Mallah is asking, how did you do it? He says, I did it by the power of my psychic power. I did it. And then the Mullah says that, if the boulder is not seen, people will, not realize what you have done. So they said, please bring back the the stone, the boulder, and the Buddha brings back this boulder. And before he does it, he smashes the boulder and pulverizes it, powders. He turns it into powder, scattered all over the place. So the Mullah says that, this is now a scattered powder. Nobody will know that this thing happened. So then Buddha again reassembles the boulder and puts it by the side of the road. So this very interesting story, let's only look at this story as a story. And it's very interesting the way Professor John Strong interpreted it in terms of, the title of this particular chapter is, first there is the Buddha, first there is this boulder, then there is no Buddha. So the Buddha vanishes from the story, and then there he is again. Buddha comes back in the story again. So, the Buddha's biographies or the stories are like that. First they make a lot of sense to us, then they disappear, and then they again begin to make great sense to us. So, I can go on talking about the story because I like the story. I thought I should share with you. So, why read Buddhist narratives? Just to switch the gears. Besides that, they offer a lot of resource in understanding society culture, as we have seen. Reading and studying Buddhist narratives is the practices of the self. They orient the mind to the vision of the Buddha. They are didactic in nature. They offer many vantage points to practice the Dhamma, and they direct our mind towards the devotion to the Buddha, particularly, and the Dhamma and the Sangha. So these are the practice of the technologies and practice and the technology of self. And as we know, Baba have said, cultivation of mind is the highest purpose. Transformation of the mind is emphasized so much. And in the today's session, we are going to see the healing of mind. So, the Buddhism, there is a famous story of a great psychologist called father of modern psychology, William James. And he happened to have invited Anagrik Dharmapal in his university, and he was delivering a lecture. And after the end of the lecture by Anagrik Dharmapal, William James told his students that this is the psychology that you are going to study in the future. That's what is happening. Buddhism has entered into the laboratories, talk people, trying to measure the mental state in the laboratories. And there is a domain of psychology called the positive domain, where we talk about the growth of our human personality, how we can become a better person, how we can cultivate, how we can realize our total human potential. But there is also what is known as the domain of psychology, as the negative psychology, where we talk about a lot of disorder, psychological, mental disorder. And interestingly, the psychiatric aspect of the human mind is dealt in the Jataka tales. This is a very interesting sort of a journey that we are going to take. So particularly the book number one, and this is the book that I talk about, and I have been reading this book for a long time, like 15 years back. I came in contact with this book, a very very interesting book, and you can see that there is a lot here in this book that one can read, and it's written by a very interesting, very knowledgeable Sri Lankan psychotherapist, Professor Dr. DVJ Harishchandra, and his daughter then Tolusha Harishchandra has published it recently. The title of the original book was Psychiatric Aspects of the Jataka Stories. And in the new rendering, she has given a subtitle, A Modern Analysis of the Ancient Stories of the Buddha's Past Lives. So there is this story. I have another book, Psychological Aspects of the Buddhist Jataka Stories. I have not got hold of this. I have gone through number of interesting papers on Buddhism and psychotherapy. And there is a lot that is emerging in this domain. This is a book that I have not read, but I have ordered. But I found the title very interesting, Psychological Aspects of Jataka Stories. Maybe in the last lecture, I will talk about these two books. So, these are all the very interesting things that are emerging. So, Jataka stories are as a positive psychology. We have seen in the past lectures as how many instances of cultivation of human personality in the Jataka stories. Particularly, we can think of Jataka stories as the lessons in the instruments of moral creativity and moral resourcefulness. So I'm not going to go into that. We have talked about it. So in one of the Jataka stories, there is a description of the psychiatric disorders, Unmad. It's called Unmad, and in the Darimukha Jataka, the Buddha describes the various psychiatric disorders, pointed out by Professor, Dr. Harishchandra, DVJ Harishchandra. Very interesting book, and so it covers a lot of domain. I'm not going to talk a lot, going to cover a lot. I'm going to just touch the things in passing. But here Buddha talks about the Kama Unmad, sexual dysfunction. And in Jataka stories, you'll find so many categories of the sexual dysfunctions and disorientation. I'm going to talk a bit about them. Then, of course, the mania, Krodh, Unmad. And, this is sometimes we have this strong propensity towards Krodha or anger. And, there are these modern disorders like, OCD, obsessive compulsive disorders, and, many disorders there are. And Professor has categorized because he's a psychiatrist, trained in England and well read in the Jataka stories. He has lectured widely on the Jataka stories. So he brings out this very interesting sort of the analogies between the psychiatric treatments and Buddhism. Then, of course, there is a darshana. There is a point, there is a unmad, or a psychiatric disorder where we hallucinate, like the cases of the schizophrenia and all. Then moha, mental retardation. Then possession disorder. Sometimes some people feel that they are possessed by certain ghosts, certain entities. And there is, of course, melancholia. Then there is a alcohol disorder, so prevalent in the society. And there are many instances in the Buddhist Jatakas which talks about alcohol. In fact, it is, I think, one of the earliest depiction of how the fermentation takes place. I'm going to talk about it. Then, of course, Vesana, depression. So they are all categories given by the Buddha in the Darimukha Jataka. But, Dr. Harishchandra has given us the whole range of the, disorders based on the Western classification in the psychiatric field. So, there is, of course, a conscious mind and unconscious mind, and Buddhism talks about unconscious mind. It's, before Freud or Carl Jung talked about the unconscious mind, the Buddha talks about how the unconscious mind, ignorance emerges when he talks about the paticca samutpada, and how the ignorance or the unconscious mind is the cause of the suffering and the mental anguish, somanas, domanas, all these very interesting things. I don't have time to go into that, but it's a very interesting domain. So how these Jataka stories, when we read them, how they influence our mind? Because they are ancient. And it's said that the ancientness of the tales, because they survived over the period of so many thousands of years, they have the validity. People liked them. They had certain appeal. The presence of primitive elements appeals to our unconscious mind, because in our unconscious mind is not about cars or flights or guns. Our primitive mind, our unconscious mind, is mostly about the sand, the forest, the water, the rivers, the arrows, the animals. And we see that in Jataka, there is the presence of this very strong presence of the primitive elements. And the Jatakas are full of symbols. And Freud talks about how we make symbols out of certain unconscious feelings. It's about splitting into good and bad, because the children loves very easy stories. They want two protagonists. They don't like complicated characters. That's how we learn to distinguish between good and bad, splitting and polarization. They offer a lot of personal meanings, and the stories are set in a uncertain time and a certain space. So there is a vagueness of this time and space and names. And there is in the stories aha experience. Sometimes there is a catharsis that goes on this in the stories. The Jataka stories are known for their dramatic action. And another fact, beautiful attribute of the story is that they are sacred because they are the part of the Buddhism, and because they are the sacred, they can suggest us, they can instruct us out of our miseries, out of our disorders. And the language used in the Jataka story is a very sophisticated, it's a very highly developed language. It said that only the scholars who are very deep into the Pali language itself, they can appreciate the nuances of the Jataka tales. And they have written it with beautiful sonic qualities or the phonic quality. And the phonic quality of the Jataka tales, when they are recited, they have a very hypnotic effect. I'm not going to go into that. If possible, I would have given this book to you, but this is available in only hard copy. So I'm going to talk about the case study of alcoholism from origin to therapy. So, in the Kumbha Jataka, we have seen the Jataka briefly in the past, that the monkeys eat certain fruit and they throw it, and there is a pond at this a small water body at the root of the tree, and it ferments, and the monkeys drink it and they get drunk. The birds, they get drunk, and Sura notices it, and when Sura notices, he also gets, you test it, he gets drunk, and then he embarks on a path to the mass production of Sura, so that the whole Jambudvipa will be intoxicated. And then the story goes that the Bodhisattva stopped from producing more liquor, alcohol, and this is said that this is how the Jambudvipa was saved from alcoholism. But it's not the case. We know that Jambudvip, there are a lot of people, they are drunkards. So this is the tragic story as to what drunkenness or alcoholism can do to us. This is a tragic story of the drunken king. So there is a king, and he is always intoxicated, and he wants something to eat. He wants non-veg to eat with his alcohol, some meat to go with his alcohol. It's a common story. And the cook is not able to give him meat, and because that's the Uposatha day, no animal is killed. But then he's playing with his child, and in the intoxication, he strangles his baby to death and orders the cook to serve it as meat. Onlookers are too shocked to utter a word, and the panic-stricken cook carries out the royal order. This is Jataka tale, Dharmadhwaja Jataka. And after his postprandial siesta, of course, he has eaten. And of course, after he had siesta, the king wakes up refreshed. And as usual, he sends for the baby to spend time fondling it. But the queen tells him what has happened to the baby. So in the drunken state, he has killed his own baby. The shocked king resolved not to take alcohol. So we know that there are many, many stories like this, that under the influence of alcohol, we all do so stupid things. We can know it by our, the example of our friends, by our own personal examples as to under the influence of intoxicants, how stupid or how foolish we behave. So this Dharmadhwaja Jataka is a very handy story when it is necessary to dissuade a patient from drinking. There's another story, interesting story, Bhadragata Jataka. In Bhadragata Jataka, God Shakra present a young man with a magic pot, which, like Aladdin wonderful lamp, can grant any wish. The young man uses the pot to obtain alcohol, and in a state of acute intoxication, drops and breaks the pot. So you see, sometimes when we are drunk, we tend to not value what is precious. And in this Jataka, Bhadragata Jataka, it's very beautifully narrated. In the Guttapanna Jataka, we have seen this Jataka tales in the previous lectures. One of very funny Jataka tale. But under the effect of alcohol on a tiny beetle in Guttapanna Jataka, which reads like one of the Aesop's fables, teaches even human beings a lesson. The beetle gets intoxicated with drops of alcohol split over by men at a riverside party. When a heap of shit, shakes with his drunken walk, the beetle assumes that the earth itself is shaking under his weight. This is what all happens. When we are drunk, you begin to boast so much. Beetle assumes that the earth itself is shaking under his weight. An elephant passing by hastens away because of the offensive smell of the faces. But the grandiose beetle asks the elephant why one warrior runs away on seeing another warrior, and challenges the elephant to a duel. The elephant stops and replies, "Why should I trample you with my clean foot, or crunch you with my clean tusk, or strike you with my clean trunk? You stand on your faces, so I will shoot you with my faces." And the elephant does. And that's how the beetle dies. So you see how we can be, under the influence of alcohol, and how Jataka stories can instruct us. Now imagine, you are reading these stories, internalize them, they come handy to you when you tend to become intoxicated. So anger management therapy, there are a lot of stories which talks about how we can manage the anger, and they are exemplary, like King Silava in Mahasilava Jatak, who is not angered by the king of Kosala, Kurundaka in the Shantivada Jataka, Prince Dharmapala in the Chula Dhammapala Jataka, monkey in Mahakapi Jataka, Nagabhuri Datta, one of the very interesting stories. He doesn't get angry even when he's caught by a charmer. Naga Champeya in the Champeya Jataka, Sankapala, Naga Sankapala in the Sankapala Jataka. The super elephant Matu Poshaka Jataka. They don't get angry, even when they when they face the worst. And these stories sort of help us to, you know, manage your anger, krodha. Professor Harishchandra talks about a lot of sexual deviations and unusual form of sexual behavior. The psychiatric treatments, particularly psychoanalysis by Freud, is all about talking about the sexual symbols, and how they affect our mind, and why not. He talks about different therapies there. Then in Jataka, there are a lot of stories that talk about the unusual forms of sexual behavior and deviations. There are a lot. I'm not going to go into that. Particularly, this is the story. This is about the gynophobic behavior, that the main hatred towards the women, and likewise man, the in the Jataka tells, the particularly this prince is so phobic, women phobic, that he doesn't want to touch, doesn't want to even drink milk, suckle on the breast, and he's so phobic. It can happen to a man, it can happen to a woman. The lot of women are traumatized because of their experiences in the life. And in the Jataka story, there is a solution also as to how the prince is made to get rid of his phobia, women phobia. There is a woman playing violin or any instrument, veena, far apart, and he listens to the veena, the veena, and then she comes closer, 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 finally in his room, and finally in his bed. So he can get rid of this conditioning of the hatred towards women, phobia towards women, phobia towards man. Similar things can happen to with the women. So in this Sankappa Jataka and Mahapaloban Jataka, there is this tendency of gynophobia. There is a lot. I cannot cover everything today. There is a very interesting story of in the Kunal Jataka of the unusual form of sexual behavior, where the queen sleeps out of the bedroom every night from the window, and there is a tree, a jambu tree, and she glides over the jambu tree, and there is a cripple, a leper, sitting at the root of the tree, and the queen offers every day herself to this cripple, and the king comes to know, and he sends her away. That's the story. And he cuts finally the jambu tree. So you see, there are like this, very there are stories like this, sexual abnormal behaviors in the Jataka tells. Here is a story of in the Kunal Jataka, where a woman has a four husband, and she gives her body to the four men at the same time, but she asks them to massage, but she asks a cripple to watch her, watch this particular thing happening from a vantage point position somewhere close to Krishna's feet, and the name of the woman is Krishna. So there are a lot of stories like this which talks about the sexual disorientation, and a lot of the sexual disorder, and how we can get rid of them. So I'm not going to go into that, but Professor talks about bibliotherapy as to how the books can be used as a therapy, how we can segregate the various Jataka tells into various story cultures and offer them to the people who are suffering or who are undergoing certain psychological or psychiatric disorders. Of course, there are medicines. He says that there are medicines also, but there is a behavioral therapy or cognitive therapies which are very interesting. So it's not just mindfulness. that help us to deal with the psychiatric disorders or psychological disorders. But also the Jataka can acts as a great sort of therapies. And there is of course psychodrama. You enact something. So in Jataka tales there are a lot of dramatic elements which when you enact them with the person who is suffering them, they can get rid of those psychological disorders. There's a lot one can talk about it, but I'm not going to go into that. Actually, what I did today, I just gave you the glimpse of the tip of the iceberg, presented you the tip of the iceberg as to how much there is in this Jataka tales, which can teach us about how we can heal our minds, how we can get rid of our disorder, how we can reorient our minds, how we can offer different ways by which we can change the perception. It's not just about meditation. The Bhavana is a very broad concept in Buddhism. So I will stop here today, and we are going to read a story today, and then of course we will follow up with any discussion or anything that we would like to discuss. So I invite today Vishakha to read a story for all of us, and let me share the screen so that she can read the story. So this is the story that we are going to read today. So can you read? Can you see? Has the story appeared on the screen, Vishakha?
Absolutely no problem.
Okay, please go ahead.
Good. Just one comment about Dr. Harshchandra.
Speak louder. Speak louder.
Yeah. Anyway, he came to our book launch. A great man. Thank you so much for that.
Louder.
Okay.
Louder. Louder.
Oh, I need to be louder? Okay.
Yeah.
Can you hear me?
Yeah. It's great to know that
Okay.
is he still alive?
Yes. He came to our book launch
Very good.
when we yeah,
He's the keynote speaker.
Wow.
he was our keynote speaker for the book launch at the Queen's Hotel
15 years ago.
15 years ago. A great
Amazing.
man. Wonderful.
Please.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay. High seat, low seat. Chavaka Jataka. It was while staying at Jatavana that the Buddha told this story about the gang of six. Once the Buddha sent for these bhikkhus and asked whether it was true that they taught the Dhamma from a low seat while their students sat on a higher seat. They confessed that it was so, and the Buddha scolded them for their lack of respect for the Dhamma. Long ago, he added, a teacher was rightly rebuked by the wise for teaching even inferior doctrines while sitting on a low seat. Then he told this story of the past. Long ago, when Brahmadatta was reigning in Varanasi, the Bodhisattva was born as a Chandala, an outcast. When he grew up, he got married and set up his own household. When his wife became pregnant, she had a great longing for ripe mangoes and asked him to get her some. My dear, he replied, this is not the season for mangoes. Would you like me to bring you some other acidic fruit? No, she replied, I must have a mango. If you don't get one for me, I will die. The poor man loved his wife very much, but he did not know what to do. Where in the world are ripe mangoes? Where in the world am I going to find a mango for her? He moaned. Suddenly he remembered that he'd heard that in the king's garden there was one mango tree which had fruit on it all year round. The only way to relieve his wife's craving was to fetch a ripe mango from that tree. That night he quietly scaled the wall and climbed the tree. Moving stealthily from branch to branch, he searched for a ripe fruit. While he was still searching, day began to break. If I climb down now, he thought, the guards will see me. I'll be arrested as a thief and thrown into prison. I'd better wait until dark so I can get away. He climbed higher and, hidden by the thick leaves, settled into a fork of the tree. A little later, the king and a Brahmin priest entered the garden and walked straight toward the mango tree. Unaware that there was a man in the branches, the king sat on a splendid couch at the foot of the tree. The Brahmin sat on a lower seat and began reciting sacred texts. How wicked this king is, thought the Chandala, as he watched and listened from his perch high above. There he is, sitting on a high seat and studying sacred texts. His teacher is just as wicked, sitting on a lower seat and teaching him. But who am I to talk? I am just as wicked as they are, for I have fallen under the influence of a selfish woman. Here I am acting like a thief and risking my life to steal a mango for her. He grabbed hold of a strong branch and swung himself down, landing on the ground right beside the king and the Brahmin. He stood up and said, "Your Majesty, I know that I am as good as dead, but you are a fool, and this priest is damning himself." "What do you mean by insulting my teacher and me in this way?" the king demanded. "Both of you, teacher and royal scholar, have sinned against the holy law," the Chandala exclaimed. "We respect your majesty and look up to you, but when you listen to the sacred texts, you should be sitting lower than your teacher. And he who is reciting the text must know that it is forbidden to do so from an inferior seat." "My food is fragrant rice from the hills," the Brahmin intoned smugly. "It has the delicate flavor of meat. I make a good living, so why should I be fussy about rules intended for saints?" "Brahmin, your sin makes your little learning useless," the Chandala insisted. "Your greed is a disgrace to the very texts you teach, and it will take you straight to hell." The king was pleased with this young man's exposition of the law. "Who are you, anyway? And what are you doing in my garden?" The man bowed to the king and replied, "Your Majesty, I am a Chandala. I secretly climbed your tree, hoping to steal a ripe mango to appease my wife's craving." "Friend," the king said, extending his hand to the astonished man, "if you had been from a family of the warrior caste, I would have made you king in my place. But let it be known that from now on I will rule by day, and you shall have power at night." The king removed a garland from his own neck and placed it around the neck of the Chandala. "I hereby appoint you protector of the city," he proclaimed. This was the origin of the custom for the protector of the city to wear a garland of red flowers. The king never forgot the Chandala's wise admonition, and thereafter, whenever he listened to the sacred texts, he showed his respect for the law by sitting on a lower seat. Having concluded his story, the Buddha identified the birth. "At that time, Ananda was the king, and I was a Chandala."
Beautiful. Sadhu, 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 sadhu. So any reflection on that would you like to share with us? Vishaka Ken, any reflection on the story that we just read? Or anyone has anything to comment on the story that is just been related? Yes, Umesh.
Sir, in this story, the main crux was on the sitting of the two people, one who is preaching and other who is the scholar who is getting the things from the his master.
Right, right.
The situation and the positions is questionable over here.
Yes.
Can we think in that way that any precious thing that is whether it is in a very dirty mud,
Yeah.
we should pick it up
I think
and it should not.
yeah. I think the essence of this particular story is that we should be receptive. We should value the truth more than anything else. right? And it shows that we should be very humble in receiving the teaching. We should be very have that, cultivate that humility for the knowledge or for the truth, for the Dhamma, right? We cannot just if somebody is offering us the Dhamma, we cannot accept it with arrogance or with ego or with putting ourselves on a higher level than them. So I think this is what is it all about. And you are, if we, there are many instances we have seen in the past that for the single verse of the Dhamma, people were ready to sacrifice their bodies, right? Just to listen to a very
Yeah, yeah.
single line of the Dhamma. That is the level of commitment that we need for the truth, for the Dhamma. And I think this exemplifies that. But I think it's also about, I think, the reason Vishaka and Cain chose this, because it's one of the another Chandala story in the Jataka, which shows that the intelligence is not born. Intelligence is not about where you are born, and he's the city protector. But it also shows that there was a strict social code, because it says that if you were a warrior caste, if you are a Kshatriya, Khattiya, I would have made you a king instead of me. But because you are a Chandala, an outcast, I can make you the protector of the city, like the commissioner of the police, right? So, yeah, I think we can pick up there. We can pick up the teachings from anywhere, wherever it is, right?
Means the root cause we are fighting with that the four varnas of in every era,
Yeah, yeah.
and the fight is still going on.
So anything on not only our Jataka story that we just read, but anything that we talked about today since the beginning? You have any comment to offer, or anything you wanted to comment on or extend or criticize? That is welcome. We can have many interpretations, as we have seen. So if there is no any urgent comment from your end, I just wanted to conclude this session by telling you that this Jataka tells 550, and there are so many stories in the Buddhist history, and they are handed down to us. And we cannot just dismiss the stories as the stories. And if we read them carefully, if we read them very carefully, and reading is a very important form of a Buddhist practice. Only recently I learned how important it is for the Buddhist to read the text, to read the stories. So when you read something with together or with yours, alone, it opens up a very different perception for you all the time. When you read something, like if you read a Jataka tells, your perception before you read it and after you read it are changed. That's the transformation that we are seeking, the movements of the mind, isn't it? And our mind moves, our perception moves as we engage with the text. And sometimes reading the normative or logical text can be easy, but it can be extremely difficult sometimes. And it is said that in the Buddhist history, the great philosophers were also poet. Dhammakirti, one of the greatest philosophers that the Buddhist world has seen, was a great poet. Nagarjuna, he wrote one of the most difficult work of the philosophical systems, Mula Madhyamika Karika, but it's in the verse form. You look at the great master Vasubandhu, one of the greatest thinkers the world might have seen. And he had captured in the 20 verses, 30 verses, the essence of the Buddha's teachings. The Buddha himself was a great intellectual, but his poetry, people say that sometimes it's not perfect, but the great man did not be a perfect man, but his poetry is excellent. Therigathas, the greatest poetries, the anthology of the poetry in the world, the first anthology of the women's poetry in the world, Therigatha, the beautiful, profound, deep. So the literature or the stories or the narratives have got a huge, it's a part of our practice, not just sitting on the cushion. We can, of course, meditate. We can cultivate the awareness. But as we have seen, the bhavana is not just about it. It's about transferring the mind. It's about cultivating the mind. There are many ways by which we can cultivate the mind. There are many technologies of self. There are many techniques by which we can cultivate. There are so many, in the Buddhist meditational manuals, you will find many ways of practice of meditation. So many practice of meditation. So many techniques. Likewise, there are so much in terms of the Jataka tales, in terms of so many stories. We have seen the evidence of that. How, the narrative story, if we change it, how it unfolds very differently in the world, like the story chosen by Baba Ambedkar. He talked about both the stories. In 1941, he talked about the story in Janata, and in the Buddhism, he talked about another story. So he knew that the stories have a power.
May I say something?
Yeah, please, Vishaka.
One of the things that I love about these stories, this one in particular, is that realize the Buddha remembered how many eons back, and he remembered every life. I don't remember any,
Yeah.
but I can put myself in these stories and think, I have been this, I have been that, I have been everything. I have been a Chandala, I have been a queen, I've been a king, I've been a Dewa, a tree Dewa, I've been a quail, I've been an elephant, I've been everything. I've lived in every circumstance over how many eons, and I don't remember. So I put myself in these stories and realize that this is how I can develop empathy with every living thing and every kind of person, because I've been there and done it in a way, and I've gone up and down from hells to heavens, and I don't remember. But the Jatakas give me an idea of so many lives that I can imagine. At one time, perhaps I was, who knows? Anyway, that opening, it helps us build empathy with all living things, all creatures,
It's a
all
great,
people.
great point. It's a wonderful point, because that set me in motion thinking about, beloved Baba Sahib Ambedkar, because he says that our human life, one life is limited, and there is a limited scope for experiences. So that's why we have to read the biographies of the great people, so that our experience is enriched by reading the biographies of so many great people, isn't it? We cannot live their life, but through engagement with their biographies, we can begin to experience at least something of their lives and enrich our own lives, as it were. And when we read the Jataka stories, as you said, we enrich our scope of experiences to the extent that it accommodate a lot of experiences. So thank you, Vishaka. That's a very insightful comment. So before we conclude, if anybody has anything to say, if not, then we will end for today, and we will meet next week for the last session on our Jatakas. So thank you so much, and see you next week.